With world leaders gathered together in Glasgow to discuss the climate emergency this week, all eyes are on the biggest polluters. It's been 6 years since the landmark Paris Agreement, when almost 200 countries agreed to combat rising temperatures, and the scorecard is bad. Most countries are failing to reduce emissions fast enough. So there was great interest when Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, took the stage. This is the statement that got everyone's attention. Quote, by 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero emissions. He also listed a 5-point plan to put India on the pathway to net zero. Modi says India will meet the following milestones in the next 9 years. By 2030, India will increase its non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatts. It will transition to 50% renewable energy sources. It will reduce projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons and reduce the economy's carbon intensity by 45%, all to reach carbon zero by 2070. Here's one climate strategist's reaction who is optimistic about Modi's promises.
The Prime Minister has set India firmly on a clean energy pathway. This can deliver net zero definitely by 2070, but hopefully India can achieve it much earlier. Just to give you an example, we are as away from 2070 as 1970 was from behind us. And I can assure you, no one would have predicted the level of transition that has already taken place in India currently.
But is that optimism realistic? Let's get more from DW's environment reporter, Ajit Naranjan, who is in Glasgow at the moment. Ajit, we just heard from a commentator who argues that Modi's pledges are strong. What do you make of Modi's alleged commitments?
So the commitment to end greenhouse gas emissions, to get them to net zero by 2070, is a big step forward in India's ambitions on climate change. And what we've heard from analysts and climate scientists is that this is actually a very promising first step, because what climate scientists have shown very clearly is that for the world to keep temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, something they pledged to do in the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, then the world needs to level out its CO2 emissions by 2050 and its greenhouse gas emissions by 2070. Now, Modi's pledged to sort out the half of that about greenhouse gases by 2070. What he hasn't been clear on is what that means for carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, whether that would also be the case. If so, it would mean that his targets are consistent with the Paris Agreement. What we're also hearing, though, is that the targets for 2030 that we just heard are much more important. If India does really manage to build out that much renewable energy to cut its CO2 emissions, then that will put it in good stead to actually follow through with this and turn its economy, which is very heavily coal dependent, into one that's actually climate friendly.
Right, and you might have noticed I just said earlier, alleged commitments, because world leaders have promised many things at these climate change conferences over the years and failed to deliver. So how reliable are the pledges that have been made?
So that's the thing about these climate conferences. These are promises, these are pledges, and they have been broken before. Most notably in 2009 at the Copenhagen summit, rich countries promised poorer ones $100 billion a year in climate finance to help them green their economies, to help them adapt to the effects of climate change. But that never came through. Last year, they did not meet that target. And now we're going to have negotiations all of today to kind of haggle over that sum of money to come up with a credible plan to fulfill that promise belatedly. And so pledges are one thing, and it's why climate scientists that we speak to are consistently stressing countries need to do things now. They need to act immediately to burn fewer fossil fuels. They need plans that are credible for 2025, for 2030. And these will help them get to these nice net zero targets by the middle of the century or a bit later. But that's not where the focus necessarily needs to be.
Right. Well, if you stand by, Ajit, we'll have more questions in just a moment, but I want to go to this next report about India's conundrum, because so many people there depend on coal. Take a look.
For these workers in India's east, coal is the only source of income. Without it, they say, they would die. If we can't do this, then we will starve. We'll have to beg. Coal has saved so many poor people. After selling sacks of coal, we can feed ourselves. This couple are also among the thousands of informal workers in the state who need coal to stay alive. They earn $3 a day by scavenging coal and selling it to traders. In this community, there are few other options. There's no arable land here, only coal, stone and fire, nothing else. Coal plays a vital role in India's economy, powering 75% of its electricity generation. And while the country has made progress in developing renewables, it says it needs coal to meet its vast energy requirements and is planning to open more plants. The livelihoods of millions of people and businesses are also connected to the industry.
Coal is really an ecosystem, right? While the primary purpose of coal extraction is to provide energy, but really, when coal industries operate, and they operate in certain pockets of India, they create lots of jobs, direct, indirect. It also provides revenues to various state governments, district governments, and also the central government.
Delhi says without coal, it will be unable to raise living standards for its people or fuel economic growth, as the West has already done. They also point out that the average Indian still uses less coal than their counterparts in the United States and Germany. But with fossil fuels now clearly identified as the driver of disastrous climate change, the question now is whether India will act in time or leave the problem to the next generation.
I mean, what you see is tension between emerging economies and developed countries. Who needs to do more?
So the developed economies have been burning fossil fuels and emitting CO2 historically that have caused the majority of this problem. What people don't necessarily realize is that even though big countries like China and India are big emitters today, there's still a historical carbon debt that rich countries, in theory, would pay poorer countries in order to kind of equal things out. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement addresses this partly. Rich countries signed up to have these common but differentiated responsibilities. And if they were to actually deliver on this, it would mean acknowledging that they would have to have more ambitious climate targets and cut their fossil fuel usage earlier. And that's what a lot of poorer countries are calling for at this conference. What's unclear, though, is what that means for the poorer countries themselves, many of which are burning fossil fuels like coal, as we just heard, which have a huge which really hurt their own citizens. It causes huge problems for mortality, it causes lung cancer and so on. And so there's an interest at home domestically to actually sort this problem out as well, even beyond what we're hearing on the international stage here.
Right, and of course the key point is, of course, Mother Nature doesn't keep score. It doesn't really matter what the historical past, determined in terms of the developed countries' responsibilities. We have a climate emergency. Ajit, Naranjan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.